Imagine a landscape so vast and unforgiving that it seems to swallow the sky. The Sonoran Desert, straddling the border of what is now Arizona and Mexico, is a place of stark, violent beauty. Here, the sun is not a source of warmth, but a hammer that beats down on the earth with relentless fury. The air is so dry it sucks the moisture from your lungs with every breath. The flora is armored cacti with needles sharp enough to pierce leather, scrub brush that claws at the skin. In the mid-19th century, this land was the stage for a collision of civilizations, so brutal that its echoes still haunt the American West. It was a war of survival, fought not with armies on open fields, but with ambushes in box canyons, raids under the light of the moon, and a cycle of vengeance that knew no mercy. At the center of this maelstrom were the Apache people, Inde, as they called themselves, meaning the people, masters of guerrilla warfare. They had adapted perfectly to this harsh environment, to the Spanish, Mexican, and later American settlers encroaching on their lands. They were ghosts, warriors who could strike without warning and vanish into the rocks before the dust had settled. But there is a darker chapter to this history, one often whispered in frontier journals or sensationalized in dime novels, yet rarely examined with the forensic seriousness it demands. It is the story of the women caught in the crossfire. This documentary will peel back the layers of myth to reveal the terrifying reality of female captivity during the Apache Wars. We will not look away from the horror. Instead, we will confront it to understand the human cost of empire and resistance. We will walk the trail of tears of the captives, dragged barefoot across miles of burning sand. We will enter the camps where women were stripped of their names, their clothes, and their identities to be remade into members of the tribe. We will examine the brutal logic of scalping, the agony of forced marriage, and the psychological scars that never faded. This is not a story of heroes and villains in black and white hats. It is a tragedy painted in shades of blood and dust, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of total erasure. To understand the fate of these women, we must first understand the anatomy of a raid. For the Apache, raiding was not merely an act of war. It was an economic necessity and a cultural imperative. In a land where resources were scarce, raiding neighboring tribes or settlements for livestock, food, and captives was a way of life that had existed for centuries before the first Europeans set foot on the continent. But as the pressure from settlers increased, the raids became more violent, more desperate. The terror usually began at dawn. Settlers living in isolated homesteads or traveling in wagon trains would wake to the sound of war. Whoops, a terrifying, ululating cry designed to paralyze the enemy with fear. The attack was swift and chaotic. Men were typically killed outright, their bodies left where they fell. But for the women and children, the horror was just beginning. They were the prizes, the livestock of war. Historical records are filled with harrowing accounts of the initial capture. Women were often dragged from their burning homes, witnessing the slaughter of their husbands and sons. Then began the forced march. The Apache needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and any potential pursuers. This meant traveling at a grueling pace, often running alongside horses for days without rest. Captives who slowed down, or who were too weak to keep up, were not shown mercy. They were considered a liability. A blow to the head with a war club or a lance thrust ended their suffering and ensured the safety of the raiding party. The terrain itself became a weapon of torture. Women accustomed to wearing shoes and long dresses were forced to navigate rocky canyons and cactus forests barefoot and half naked. Their clothes would be torn to shreds by the mesquite, their feet turning into bloody pulp on the sharp volcanic rock. Alonso de Benavides, a Spanish friar writing in the 1600s, described the trail of blood left by captives. A grim marker that guided pursuers but also served as a testament to the captive's endurance. The psychological trauma of this journey, the dehydration, the physical pain, the grief broke many before they even reached the Apache strongholds in the mountains. Once they arrived at the rancheria, the Apache encampment, the captives entered a new phase of their ordeal, the stripping of identity. This was not a metaphorical process. It was literal and often violent. The women were stripped of their European or Mexican clothing, which was burned or distributed among the tribe. They were forced to bathe in icy streams to wash away their old life. Their hair, often a source of pride and cultural identity, was sometimes cut or styled in the Apache fashion. They were given new names. Their old names were never to be spoken again. This process of assimilation was driven by a complex mix of pragmatism and cultural belief. The Apache population was constantly depleted by war and disease. Captives were a way to replenish numbers, to bring new blood into the tribe. Children were often adopted and raised as Apache, forgetting their original families entirely. But for adult women, the transition was far more brutal. They were often initially treated as slaves, besut gen forced to perform the most menial and back-breaking labor. They were the ones who gathered the firewood, hauled the water, and tanned the hides. Tanning was grueling work, involving scraping flesh from skins and working brains into the leather for hours until it was soft. If a captive woman refused to work, or if she worked too slowly, punishment was swift. Whipping with rawhide quirts was common. These beatings were not just about pain, they were about dominance. They were public spectacles designed to show the captive her place in the social hierarchy. She was at the bottom, below the dogs, until she proved herself useful. Olive Oatman, perhaps the most famous captive of the era, provides a window into this world. Captured by the Yavapai, often confused with Apache in 1851, at the age of 14, she and her sister watched their family being massacred. They were then enslaved, beaten, and starved. Olive later recounted how they were forced to forage for roots and berries to survive, often digging in the hard earth with their bare hands until their fingers bled. Her story, though later sensationalized, underscores the crushing reality of servitude. She was eventually traded to the Mojave, where her treatment improved. But the initial trauma of her enslavement remained the defining scar of her life, mirrored by the blue tattoo on her chin that marked her as a captive. But servitude was often just a prelude to a more permanent form of subjugation, forced marriage. In the Apache worldview, a woman captured in war became the property of the warrior who took her. He could sell her, trade her, kill her, or take her as a wife. For many captives, marriage was a euphemism for institutionalized rape and forced breeding. These unions were rarely consensual. They were political and social arrangements designed to integrate the captive into the kinship network of the tribe. A captive woman forced into such a marriage found herself in a position of extreme vulnerability. She was isolated, often unable to speak the language, and completely dependent on her husband for protection. If he was kind, her life might be bearable. If he was cruel, it was a living hell. She was expected to bear his children, raising a new generation of warriors who would fight against her own people. This created a profound psychological conflict. Many captive women developed deep bonds with their half-Apache children, torn between their love for their offspring and their desire to return to their original culture. The story of Cynthia Ann Parker, captured by the Comanche, whose practices mirrored the Apache in many ways, illustrates this tragedy. She spent 24 years with the tribe, married a chief, and had 3 children. When she was finally rescued by Texas Rangers, she was devastated. She starved herself to death, mourning the loss of her native family. For Apache captives, the dynamic was similar. The Stockholm Syndrome, or perhaps simply the human instinct to adapt and survive, meant that the line between captive and family member blurred over time. But this integration came at the cost of the woman's original self. She had to kill the white woman or the Mexican woman inside her to allow the Apache woman to live. However, not all captives were integrated. Some were kept as second wives or concubines, occupying a permanent underclass status. They were often resented by the first wives, who viewed them as interlopers and rivals for resources. These captives faced abuse not just from the men, but from the women of the tribe, creating a lonely, hostile environment where danger lurked in every interaction. Violence in the Apache Wars was reciprocal and escalating. As settlers encroached further, the brutality intensified. One of the most feared practices was scalping. While popular culture often attributes this solely to Native Americans, historical evidence shows it was a practice exacerbated by colonial bounties. The Mexican government, desperate to stop Apache raids, offered cash payments for Apache scalpsmen, women, and children. The Apache, in turn, scalped their enemies as a form of retaliation and spiritual dominance. For a captive woman, witnessing a scalping was a trauma that shattered the mind. But being the victim of scalping was a fate worse than death. Contrary to popular belief, scalping was not always fatal. If the skull was not fractured, a victim could survive, though they would be permanently disfigured and often ostracized by their own society upon return. The scalp was taken as a trophy, a tangible proof of a warrior's prowess. In Apache culture, the scalp was sometimes used in victory dances, a ritual celebration of the defeat of the enemy. Imagine the terror of a captive woman forced to watch these dances. She would see the hair of her neighbors, her friends, perhaps her own family members, waving on the ends of poles. It was a form of psychological terrorism. It sent a clear message: we own you. We own your life. And we own your death. The fear of scalping was so pervasive that many settler women carried poison or made pacts with their husbands to be killed rather than taken alive. Mutilation went beyond scalping. In the fierce cycle of revenge, bodies were often desecrated to ensure the enemy could not enter the afterlife whole, or simply to express rage. Captives might have their noses or ears cut off, a punishment sometimes used for adultery within the tribe, but also applied to enemies. Finger joints might be severed. These permanent marks served as a living warning. A woman released or escaped with such disfigurements became a walking billboard for Apache power, spreading fear wherever she went. Fire was another instrument of terror. The Apache, like many tribes of the Southwest, understood the primal fear of burning. Historical accounts describe captives being tied to wagon wheels or trees and subjected to slow roasting. This was often reserved for male prisoners, but women were not exempt, particularly if they had fought back or if the tribe was seeking specific revenge for the killing of their own women. One particularly gruesome method involved tying a captive spread eagled on top of a large anthill or in the blazing sun, sometimes smearing them with honey or grease to attract insects. While less common than the quick brutality of the raid, these torture methods were part of the psychological warfare landscape. The threat of such a death was often enough to ensure total compliance from captives. It is important to pause here and acknowledge the context. The Apache were fighting a war of extinction. They were being hunted like animals, their food sources destroyed, their families massacred by soldiers and scalp hunters. The violence they inflicted was a mirror of the violence visited upon them. Apache women were raped, enslaved, and killed by soldiers and settlers with frightening regularity. The cruelty was systemic, but for the individual woman caught in the middle, the rancher's wife, the Mexican villager politics didn't matter. Only the pain mattered. The psychological toll of living in this environment is hard to overstate. Captive women lived in a state of hypervigilance. They learned to read the moods of their captors, to make themselves invisible, to suppress every instinct of rebellion. They suffered from what we would now call complex PTSD. They disassociated from their bodies to survive the rapes and the beatings. They forgot their languages. Many, when rescued, were unable to speak, unable to make eye contact. Reduced to a primal state of survival, the return to civilization was often another tragedy. Society in the 19th century did not know how to deal with these women. They were often viewed as damaged goods. The Victorian morality of the time placed a high value on female purity. A woman who had been despoiled by savages was often shunned by her own community. She was a living reminder of the community's failure to protect its own. Olive Oatman became a celebrity, touring the country to tell her story. But her face tattooed with the blue lines of the Mojave marked her forever as an outsider. She suffered from depression and headaches for the rest of her life. Other women were locked away in asylums, unable to reintegrate. Some, like Cynthia Ann Parker, tried repeatedly to escape back to the tribes, finding the civilized world colder and more cruel than the one they had left. The children born of these forced unions faced an even harder path. They belonged to neither world. They were rejected by white society as half-breeds and often viewed with suspicion by the tribes if they were recaptured. They were the physical embodiment of the conflict, carrying the war in their very blood. The story of captive women in the Apache Wars is not a comfortable one. It resists simple narratives of good versus evil. It challenges us to look at the American West not as a glorious frontier of expansion, but as a zone of catastrophic collision. It forces us to confront the reality that the founding of the West was built on the bodies of women, white, Mexican, and Native alike. These women were the collateral damage of Manifest Destiny. Their suffering was the fuel for the dime novels and the John Wayne movies, sanitized and repackaged as entertainment. But the reality was dirt, blood, hunger, and a silence that stretched for miles. As we look back at the history of the Southwest, we must remember the names that have been forgotten. We must remember the women who were dragged into the canyons, the women who were traded for horses, the women who learned to tan hides to avoid the whip. Their resilience is the true story of the frontier. They survived the unendurable. They adapted when their worlds were burned to ash. In the end, the tragic fate of captive women reveals the ultimate cost of the clash of civilizations. It reminds us that when men go to war for land, for resources, or for pride, it is often women who pay the price with their bodies and their souls. The wind that blows through the jagged rocks of the Dragoon Mountains today still carries their whispers. If you listen closely enough, a testament to a time when survival was the only victory that mattered.